If I were to ask you what you think the most difficult thing about my job is, about being a pastor, what's the hardest thing, the most difficult thing to do? Many of you would think that it is writing and delivering the sermon each week. Because for many of you, you think, I would never be able to do that. I can't write like that, I can't speak in front of people like that, I just couldn't do it. Well, in reality, that's normally the easiest, although the most time-consuming part of the job. Those of us who are called to this ministry typically enjoy the writing process and aren't really afraid of speaking in public. Some might think then that it's funerals. Funerals have got to be the hardest part. Well, I'm not going to tell you they're easy. They're not. They're certainly difficult, especially when it's someone you know well and someone you love. It's hard. Well, they're not the hardest part. The hardest part of the job, at least emotionally, is visiting those who are facing pain and death at their home or at a nursing home or at the hospital. To be able to regularly and consistently reach out and support people under your care, the sheep that you have been called to shepherd, when they are at their lowest point, it takes a toll. It's a weight that must be carried. Yet at the same time, I think that it is probably one of the most Christ-like things that I am able to do in His name. Let's consider people at their lowest point and in their darkest hour. As we look at our text here this morning, Luke chapter 8, verses 22 through 25, beginning in verse 22, it says this: One day, Jesus said to His disciples, "Let's go over to the other side of the lake." So they got into a boat and set out. Jesus says to His disciples, "Let's go over to the other side of the lake." Now, it may not be your cup of tea, but most people find a boat ride on a lake to be a fine way to spend an afternoon. What a relaxing way to spend the day, cruising on the lake in a boat. For Jesus and His disciples, there is no reason to think that anything exciting will happen this day. It was perfectly normal to use boats to cut across the Sea of Galilee from one side to the other. They must have done this dozens of times. Several of the disciples had been fishermen on this very lake before they became followers of Jesus Christ. Getting into a boat in the Sea of Galilee is no big deal. A normal day, a regular activity, just going about the business of life. No reason to be on your guard about anything. Verse 23. As they sailed, he fell asleep. A squall came down on the lake, so that the boat was being swamped, and they were in great danger. Now it continues peacefully enough. Jesus fell asleep. That might not be your favorite thing, but I know plenty of people enjoy an afternoon nap now and again. Nothing can be more normal or relaxing to them than an afternoon nap. Jesus' schedule is certainly jam-packed with people that need His help, people constantly coming to Him for help. No reason not to take advantage of this momentary peace on the boat that He has found as they glide across the lake so He can catch up on some rest. And then we see this. A squall came down on the lake. Peter, James, and John may have noticed the warning signs, the wind shifting, the clouds changing before the storm hit. But storms on the Sea of Galilee can appear very quickly, and they can be very ferocious. The lake sits in a bowl with hills all around it, so that when a storm comes up, it is inevitably quickly, and it is with fierce winds. If you look at the Greek that Luke uses here, he is literally saying that it was a windstorm of wind. A windstorm of wind. Evidently, the wind got everybody's attention. Now, a boat on a lake on a cool, sunny day is one thing. A boat in the middle of a storm, as the waves grow higher and higher, is a whole different thing. What started as a routine, even relaxed relaxing day has suddenly become a day of crisis with no warning at all. But life is like that sometimes, isn't it? Just another average day, nothing exciting going on, and then, bam, car accident. Just a routine doctor's appointment. Oh, by the way, you have cancer. Just another day at work. Oh, by the way, we're going to have to let you go. Just another breakfast with your spouse. Oh, by the way, I'm leaving you. Life is like that sometimes. Now, there are things that we worry about and fear because we reasonably expect them to happen. Things that are normal parts of life that we know are going to happen. And then there are things that come out of nowhere and punch us in the gut. I'm not sure which one is worse. Worrying about the things that are probably going to happen that you know eventually will be an issue, or the sudden realization that the unexpected has just happened. Either way, life can turn from great to terrible in an instant. So how did the disciples react to this unexpected change? The first part of verse 24, the disciples went and woke him, saying, Master, Master, we are going to drown. There isn't much reason to be afraid of a few waves on a boat if the professional sailors in charge of the boat are still calm. They've seen waves like this, not a problem. When they panic, when the sailors are afraid, it's time to get your affairs in order. Now, we're not told which disciples were scared, but I'm guessing that the fishermen were afraid too, or they wouldn't have bothered to wake Jesus up. Because we've all been through bumps in the road, setbacks, temporary defeats that required us to persevere and hang in there. These are considered normal parts of life. We can handle it. Then there are situations that defy the optimist to stay cheerful. Things that don't have a bright side to look upon, or a silver lining to search for. Things like massacres and disasters and tragedy and war. You see, when the cancer doctor says, don't worry about it, we caught it in time, most of us could breathe again. Okay, the odds are good, it's okay. But when the doctor looks at you and you can tell that he's worried, when he hesitates because he isn't sure how to start, doesn't know what to say, then we know we're in real trouble. For the disciples, this is one of those. This is one of these what do we do now moments. And there are no easy answers, no quick fixes. To live through it, to survive is enough. That's enough to worry about right now. Just get me through today. You may have been in this type of trouble in the past. You may be going through it right now. If you say, nope, neither one, never been through it, not doing it now, you will be someday. It's a fact of the existence that we all share. There will be a day that comes for which you and I have no answers. None of us know how we will react to that day. We cannot say how we will respond to devastating news, even if we've been through tough times before, even if we think we are strong, even if we think we are resilient. Because each crisis, each fight against tragedy is its own battle. Perhaps our strength and endurance will be enough. Maybe it won't. In the moment when it happens, we will find out. Well, the disciples, in their moment of crisis, assumed the worst case scenario. We are going to die, we are going to drown. Because it was on the verge of coming true. Before we get to Jesus' response, take notice that this is a real storm. The disciples are drowning in a moment. This is very real. The boat is about to sink. This is not a metaphor. This is not a story. This is real life happening to them. Now, God is fully aware that as mortals and finite beings, our lives can be easily snuffed out. He is eternal. We are mortal. He's not expecting us to ignore danger, nor to laugh in its face. So what does God ask of us when our life is on the verge of being snuffed out? Let us look then at verse 24b. We'll see how the story continues. He got up and rebuked the wind and the raging waters. The storm subsided, and all was calm. Jesus got up and rebuked the wind and the waves. In a crisis situation, people often do things that don't make much sense or much of a difference. They feel the need to do something, anything, and so they react in ways that seem silly or foolish in retrospect. If you or I had stood up on the boat in the midst of the storm and told the waves, "Cut it out, be calm," and we somehow lived through the storm anyway, we'd be laughing at ourselves afterwards because we don't have the power to do anything about the wind and the waves. Jesus is just as human as we are, but he is also more. As the Son of God, he has a connection to creation that has already enabled him to turn water into wine, and will soon allow him to multiply the bread and the fishes by thousands. The storm subsided, and all was calm. One of the things that makes disasters so traumatizing is the powerlessness that we experience in their midst. During a hurricane or an earthquake or some such disaster, there isn't much we can do for ourselves or for anyone else. Likewise, when a terminal diagnosis is given, or a massive stroke or heart attack occurs, we feel helpless. And that helplessness intensifies the fear or anxiety that we experience. In his life here on earth, Jesus demonstrated clearly that he was never powerless. When faced with an impossible situation, even with death, Jesus was able to make a miracle happen. Jesus was able to overcome. When the disciples woke Jesus in their panic, it was not a question of whether or not he had the power to stop the storm. It was only a question of whether or not Jesus had the desire to stop the storm. Which raises the age-old question that has been asked by humanity since Job contended with God about his undeserved misfortune. That question is simply this: why? Why are some storms calmed while other ones rage on? Why is Don Piper, who visited us here, a medical marvel, able to tell his tale of miraculous survival when our loved one suffered and died? Why him and not them? Why does a tornado destroy one home and kill its occupants, and the home right next to it looks completely untouched? In theology, we call that whole discussion of the existence of evil and tragedy and misfortune in our world and the explanation of God's will and his power in response to it, we call that theodicy. It is the single toughest topic that any Christian apologist, any Christian writer can write about, precisely because it tries to find wisdom for us when considering two powerful ideas. One is the absolute reality of evil and misfortune and tragedy and death in our world. Anybody who doesn't think they're real hasn't been paying attention. And the other is the demonstrated power of God over each and every one of them in history. To reconcile the power of God to potentially intervene every time with the reality that God only intervenes, at least from our perspective, a minority of the time. It's not easy. The answer that we attempt to give to reconcile those two ideas, whatever it is and however brilliant the author of it may be, will ultimately fail to fully satisfy our curiosity. We will be left with three choices to consider. Number one, God is not powerful enough to overcome evil. If that is true, existence is ultimately doomed and hope is non-existent. Choice number two, God is not willing to overcome evil. If that is true, we're in worse shape than the first time, because now we're questioning the character of God, and we have complete hopelessness once again. The third answer is the only one that we have. We are not able to understand why God would, We are not able to understand why God chooses to use his power in some situations, but refrains from doing so in others. This is the answer that Job received to his justifiable question when he asked God, why? Why me? God did not feel obligated to defend himself to Job, an explanation that in any case would have been beyond his ability to grasp. Now, you may not appreciate that an answer to the question of why is not going to happen. It may not be what our heart wants when it is battered or torn or bitter, but it is.
Bless you.
But it is what we must live with, like allergies. A brief explanation before I move on to the conclusion of this message. We have been given some hints, some small hints, as to what that ultimate answer will one day be. In Romans 8:28 and 29, Paul explains that God's ultimate, final purpose for each one of us and all of us collectively is to shape and mold us into the image of Jesus Christ. In working toward that lofty goal, we will sometimes receive exactly what we want from God. And we will sometimes experience things that we do not want and never ask for. That is as far as our explanation from God is going to go. However, it is a disservice when Christians try to explain the quote-unquote good that God is going to make happen through their tragedy. To do this to someone who has just suffered a loss, especially the death of a loved one, is a massive lack of compassion for their very real suffering that they are currently going through. Those who do this are trying. They think that they are helping. They are trying vainly to answer a question that God told Job was unanswerable. And in reality, they're portraying God as someone who would choose to use evil in order that good may result. That is both illogical and contrary to the nature of God. God only knows holiness. He will never use evil to make good happen. He couldn't do it. So in the end, it will not be our ability to have all of our questions answered that draws us closer to God. But instead, it will be our willingness to trust God in the face of our unanswered questions, because we do know the love that God has for us. And we have therefore placed our hope in his ultimate purpose for all of us and our world. Jesus rebuked the wind and the waves. They subsided. What is he going to say to his disciples about this situation? The first part of verse 25 says this: "Where is your faith?" he asked his disciples. As I was writing this week's sermon, it took me a while to get past writing that down. It took me a while to decide what to say about Jesus' question of his disciples' conduct. I looked at a bunch of commentaries without much help, because they mostly focused on talking about how God calms the storms in our life as a metaphor. That the disciples should have realized that about God, and that they needed to trust God more than they did. Okay, but not very helpful here. While it is true that we need to trust God, and that is what I'm hoping that today's message will help us all continue to do together, I don't think that saying that we shouldn't be afraid when it looks like we're about to drown, whether it be literal or just a metaphor, is the answer that we need. In order to trust God more, we need to be honest about our doubt and our fear. We need to recognize that God has not promised to calm every storm in our lives if we somehow have enough faith that He will do it. He never promised us that. What we need faith for and what we need trust for is so that we can get through the storms of life. So that if God chooses not to calm this one or that one, our trust in Him will see us through. Even if we ourselves do not live to see the end of this particular storm, our trust will see us through. If God calms the storm, removes that tumor, repairs that relationship, or solves whatever else it is that put our faith to the test, we will obviously be grateful and our trust in God will be strengthened. But we will still be left with two other scenarios. First is, what do we do until our prayers are answered? And secondly, what do we do if our prayers are answered with a no? The disciples were in the first category. God did calm their storm. He solved their problem. But until He did, life itself appeared to be on the verge of ending. It's easy for us to say that God wasn't going to let Jesus and the disciples drown. They should have known that. His mission is important. That's hindsight. That's hindsight from people that weren't in the boat when wave after wave crashed over the side. How were the disciples supposed to keep their faith when all they can see is darkness and storm? That's the key. The disciples, if they only considered what they could see with their own eyes, if the here and now blocks out all else, faith will be sorely put to test. It is no small thing to have perspective in the midst of horror and sorrow, but it is what we need. Jesus told a parable about a foolish man who built his house upon sand, and a wise man who built his upon the rock. That rock is our faith in God, faith in the goodness and love of God, faith that has chosen to embrace the big picture and see beyond today. Now, we will not usually be able to see our deliverance before it gets here. We don't know when it's coming or how much longer we have to wait until it does. Our only hope, our only prayer of keeping our faith intact is to close our eyes and trust that God knows our future. I'm not saying this like it's something that is easy to do. Quite the contrary. I know that I myself will face days that will test my faith, as will each one of us. Which is why we need to continue to build upon the rock by trusting more and more in God each day, especially now while the sun is shining. If we build firmly upon the rock today, we will be able to stand firm when trouble assails us. But what if, unlike what He did for the disciples, God doesn't calm our storm? What is the purpose of faith as we sink beneath the waves. Faith was never about getting our own way or having things turn out the way we wanted them to. Sorry if that bursts your bubble. If somebody told you otherwise, they were wrong. Faith is trusting in God because we know the character of God. As one of the hymns I love says, my faith has found a resting place, not in device or creed. I trust the ever-living one. His wounds for me shall plead. I need no other argument. I need no other plea. It is enough that Jesus died and that he died for me. Faith answers the biggest questions about the purpose and meaning of life, as well as giving us assurance about life after death, all of which allows us to withstand the uncertainty and the setbacks and the loss that we will face in life here. Because we know that God will one day right our wrongs and will one day turn our sorrows to joys. So what can faith give us if our very life is slipping away from us? Hope. Hope born from a relationship with a God who loved you enough to die in your place. And hope that recognizes perspective and eternity. None of this talk of the future and God's plans is meant to minimize the problems of today. Remember that even though he was moments away from raising Lazarus from the dead, Jesus still wept at his grave because of his own love for Lazarus and his compassion for Mary and Martha. Because Jesus lived a mortal life here on earth, complete with all of the weaknesses that you and I have except for sin. We know that God not only understands our struggles, but sympathizes with us as we fight against them. Here's the final conclusion, verse 25b. In fear and amazement they asked one another, who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him. The disciples forgot momentarily the power of God because they were overcome by their fear of the storm. It could happen to any of us. Everyone has a breaking point. Jesus reminds them that God, though, is with us, even in our darkest moments, even when we are at our weakest. We may falter, we may stumble. God never will. God has asked you to put your trust in him. He has shown you that he is trustworthy. And he has demonstrated his power over all of creation, over evil, over sin, and over death. As a church of Jesus Christ, we stand together in our hope and faith, ready to support anyone who stumbles, ready to lift up anyone who falls. Even when the wind howls, even when the thunder is rumbling, our faith will prevail. Because we serve the risen Christ, and his victory is assured.